Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us yet again to another Saving Elephants live stream cross-partisan roundtable. I've got to come up with a shorter title than that. But that is what we're doing tonight. This is a live stream. Thank you for everyone who is joining us. As a reminder, if you are watching, you can post questions in real time and make comments. Depending on their tastefulness, I may or may not share them. And we will share them here with the panel. We are just a little over 2 weeks away from the 2024 presidential election. This has been an insane election season, and it's honestly seemed like things have calmed down a little bit as far as nobody's getting shot at and nobody's dropping out of the race unexpectedly. But things are still pretty crazy, and I have on a group of fine panelists to help discuss things with us. Eric Cohn, who is no stranger to this group, the Chief Marketing Officer of Empower Illinois. I have that right, Eric?
That is correct.
I got it that time. Okay, third time's
Nailed
the
it.
charm. The producer of the excellent documentary, The Hong Konger, and the former man about town, if you will, of the Acton Institute. Thank you so much for hopping on the call again with us, Eric.
Thank you.
I'm going to add to the call because I saw he just joined us. Mike Taylor. Mike is here. Good to have you, Mike.
How you doing, Josh? It's good to be back on the Saving Elephants podcast. It's always a pleasure to be back and discuss politics with you. And good to see you too, Eric. And pleasure to meet you, Brooke. Good to see you, Nate.
Yeah, good to have you, Mike. Mike, of course, is the host of the aptly named The Political Mike, where I am occasionally his token Republican on the show, and occasionally Eric shows on too. So I'm not always the only one, but you're very kind to be our occasional token Democrat, if you will, or not Republican. I'll describe it that way. The other in the room, Nathan Honore. Good to have you. This is your inaugural showing on the Saving Elephants panel. Nathan is friends with Mike. I became acquainted with him through Mike. He is a graduate of is it Quinnipiac? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Quinnipiac University. Okay. School of Law and digital organizer. And in 2023, he was a delegate to the first Working Families Party National Convention. I have no idea what that is. Nathan, what is that?
Well, the Working Families Party is a minor... I think the best way to describe it would be as something of the Tea Party of the left.
Okay.
Where we both have our own kind of candidates and also endorse other candidates to run in Democratic primaries. It was founded in the late 90s by a bunch of Jesse Jackson alumni from his 1988 presidential run. And is more focused on like grassroots advocacy and pulling the Democratic Party more towards the New Deal kind of platform than the more modern, almost Clintonite third way platform that we've seen in recent years.
Okay, that helps. In my all of 30 seconds of research, I noticed that they had nominated Kamala Harris for president, so they're not fielding their own candidates in all races. They're in some cases nominating other parties. Oh, looks like you're muted.
It's embarrassing. In New York and Connecticut specifically, the party benefits from fusion voting, which is where a candidate can receive the endorsement of multiple parties. And everything gets tabulated together in the aggregate. So Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are our nominees for president and vice president in New York. And we're actually currently engaged in a campaign to supporters all across the state to encourage them to vote for Harris Walz on row D of the New York ballot so that we get their votes and maintain our ballot access within the state of New York.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. And last but certainly not least, gentlemen, please be on your best behavior. For the second time on these roundtables, we actually have another lady joining us. We are very happy to have no stranger to Saving Elephants, but man, it has taken a while to get you back on one of these shows. Brooke Medina, my good friend from the last of the Amigos from the Saving Rights podcast. We haven't had on I was going to say chief operating officer, the vice president of communications. There we go, for the John Locke Foundation there in North Carolina. Brooke, it is always fun to have you on the program.
Well, thank you for having me and being patient and inviting me on again. You know, every once in a while, you just never know if you're going to get an invite back somewhere. But apparently I didn't mess it up too much. So
I am nothing if not persistent. No, I'm glad we could have all of you on. I know that politics in North Carolina has been really boring, so I'm not sure why you wouldn't have had any time to join us.
Not a thing going on over here.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
And we may zoom in on states here in a bit, but I wanted to start off with, as it kind of said in the teaser, the description of this, the sort of, hey, where are we at in this race? Now, I'm going to lay my cards on the table up front because I'm not going to ask anyone the very unfair question, please tell me who is going to win this thing regarding the presidential race. We can talk about congressional here in a moment. If you have a thought, I'm more than happy to hear if you think it's going to be Trump or Harris and why that might be. A little bit earlier today, I was listening to the New York Times excellent podcast, The Editorialist's Matter of Opinion. And they had on this their guest, Kristen Soltis Anderson, millennial fellow conservative pollster who I admire greatly. And she would not answer that question. And it wasn't even a matter of, look, I'm a pollster, it wouldn't be fair for me to say. It was this race was one, she said, it's remarkable in how tight it has been and how doggedly tight it has been in all 7 swing states. And so for any pollster worth their salt to try to weigh out, hey, here's who I think is going to win, they have to give that caveat. So following her lead, I have no idea. I felt less uncertain about a race, and I can't remember when, as to who might be winning this thing. But I'm curious what you guys are hearing. Is that your take also, or do you have a strong inkling one way or another?
So I think now, again, granted, polls are a snapshot in time. And so right now it does seem that Trump might have a slight edge polling wise. And that's a fairly recent development. I know, looking at 538, they have just moved their projections to a potential Trump win. But I really think there is still something to be said about a silent Trump voter. We talked about that in 2016. We talked about it in 2020. And I do think there are still some remnants in predominantly blue areas that are inclined to still vote for him, but just tell no one about it. And so I kind of guess that he's probably going to eke out a win here. I'm going to give a quick anecdote, and that's, I was at dinner last night, and the people that we were sitting at a bar eating dinner, and the couple next to us sitting at the bar were those that lean left. They said they were leaning more progressive, but they said that they were probably going to vote for Trump, and they weren't going to tell anyone else about it, though. They were just going to keep that silent because they didn't want their friends knowing. And I think that's representative of a number of voters in swing states like North Carolina.
Did they, just curious, Brooke, did they happen to, I realize you're probably just eavesdropping, to happen to say why that was?
Why? The economy. The economy.
Okay.
I think Brooke's diagnosis is probably correct, that I feel like this has been a toss-up for really ever since maybe 2 or 3 weeks after Harris got into the race and replaced Biden. I think there was a sugar high that she was able to enjoy that propelled her beyond Trump at that point in time. I think it's leveled off, and I think it's kind of like watching 2 horses running down the stretch of the Kentucky Derby that are just neck and neck, and you're wondering which one's going to win by a nose. The problem with this is, and I want to commend this to everyone, to just as an interesting product that's out there, but I think it strikes some parallels. There's a podcast from the guy that does the Slow Burn podcast. He has a new one out called Fiasco. And the first season covers the 2000 Bush v. Gore election. And where he starts the first episode of that is with Elian Gonzalez. And the point that he makes with that, and with the story he tells in there about Homestead Air Force Base and the attempts to redevelop Homestead Air Force Base in Florida near the Everglades into a commercial airport, which Gore would not really take a position on, is in a race that ended up being as close in Florida as it was. Everything and nothing is responsible for that outcome. Like, it's an overdetermined phenomenon. Everything has some plausibility as to why Gore may have lost that race. And I think that's the problem with trying to diagnose anything right now with this presidential election. It's that it's so tight. It's a toss-up. It's a toss-up in a handful of states that are still the ones that are going to determine the outcome of this election. The last couple of presidential elections were determined by tens of thousands of votes across a handful of states. And that dynamic really fundamentally has not changed. So, I'm really only talking on vibes at the moment, on just, it seems like Trump is doing a little bit better. But it's a coin flip, and like maybe 51 times out of 100, you flip it, Trump would win right now. But boy, it is just going to be incredibly close. I don't think that's a good thing for the country. I don't think it's going to be a fun thing for the country on election night, which is going to turn into election week, which, again, having gone back and just listened to something about Bush v. Gore, turned into election month. I don't think that's good for the health of the country, but it's where we're at right now.
I guess I'll chime in. Well, well, Josh, it would probably not surprise you that I might take a different opinion, but I do want to acknowledge.
That's what you're here for.
I want to acknowledge some of the strengths of the Trump campaign. I think it's important to remember when Trump jumped into this race. It was literally the night of the midterm elections of 2022, and one of the major factors that characterized his campaign early on was that it was very well disciplined and compared to 2016 and 2020. Pundits from both sides of the aisle, whether you're watching MSNBC or Fox, were both praising how well-oiled the campaign machinery was for the Trump campaign. He did not, engage in any of the debates against his primary rivals, and it didn't put a dent in his candidacy. I do not believe that that's the Trump we're seeing now. I think that the Trump campaign is not as disciplined as it was earlier on. The messaging is not as consistent. In 2016, around this time, we're in late October now. The tariffs, getting out of NAFTA. Those are the things that the Trump campaign was hitting home, in spite of the fact that he was caught on tape with the Access Hollywood, stuff, and that resonated with a lot of people in the key battleground states that we're looking at, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania. That is not the case now. I think, in contrast, and this is coming from someone that, I'm going to be straight up. Kamala Harris wasn't my first choice as the candidate. Nate knows, and Josh, Biden. I was going with Biden all the way, but I can't really say that she hasn't been very disciplined. I think she's probably one of the most disciplined candidates I've seen in a presidential race. She's been consistently on message, and even in going on certain podcasts and making certain television appearances, it's very well, her method is very well thought out. She's going on Charlemagne's podcast to address her agenda for the black community in light of recent reports that she is slipping in support with black men. She's on Roland Martin's show talking about how she's going to continue the investment of in historically black colleges and universities. She's talking about allowing the federal government to give tax credits to families who have children under the age of 18, to small businesses, to first-time homeowners. Those are the things that I think are resonating with folks in the middle. And another thing that I wanted to point out was, in contrast, when I'm looking at Trump, for 38, 39 minute swing to music, I think recently, his most recent rally, he was even alluding to something pertaining to Arnold Palmer. I don't want to get into that, but it's not the same in terms of 2016 and 2020. It's a different style. So my assessment is therefore different, and I do think that Kamala Harris will be elected. I subscribe to Professor Alan Lichtman's ideology that polls literally mean nothing. Polls literally, I think, as Brooke mentioned in the top of the show, are snapshots in time, and that there are other consistent factors, such as, the economy, as you alluded to, that folks look at. One of the things that I will say before I transition to whoever is going to jump in next is I think the Democrats need to do a better job at making a case for or against the fact that Trump is Mr. Economy. I think the Democrats need to, through their candidate Harris, hit home that, if you go back to the Trump years, even before COVID, the Trump tax cuts primarily benefited those who are at the top 1%. Trump nearly ballooned the deficit by over $2 trillion. Even the S&P 500, when you look at market gains under Trump, they pale in comparison to those under the Obama years. 67% during Obama's last 3 years compared to only 45% under Trump. These are facts that the American people are oblivious to because they've allowed Trump to go on and continue saying that he's Mr. Economy and to paint a rosy picture before COVID-19. And the Democrats need to be more aggressive, in my view, in making the case in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. I know it's, very cutting it very close, but it's better late than never.
Mike, as usual, you have entertained some ideas that I'm sure other panelists want to weigh in on, but I want to give Nathan an opportunity to respond to that question too. How are you feeling about the Trump v. Harris race? Do you have a strong confidence one way or another, or are you equally uncertain as I am?
You know, it's interesting because around like major elections, I always feel a little nervous, a little antsy, almost neurotic, I'd say. And I don't generally take that as an indicator either way. I think generally when you look at, if you look closely enough at most campaigns like state ones and really pay attention to the issues and how and trends and how things are going, it's not super difficult to forecast. Like 2022, for example, I felt pretty confident thinking that Democrats would keep and maybe even expand their Senate majority while the House was. I I did not bother thinking about the House because the House looks too much like a coin flip for me to feel confident either way, which is how it turned out. This time around, the only prediction I'm confident in making is that it's not actually going to be close. Someone is going to pretty significantly outperform their polling. And it's not going to be, a 270, 268 type of scenario where we're all like biting our fingernails at 4 o'clock in the morning on, Thursday morning looking at Nevada or something. That said, it became pretty clear once Kamala Harris became the nominee that the Trump campaign was really caught on its back foot, that they weren't really prepared for the eventuality of Joe Biden stepping down. Because their first few lines of attack were, Kamala Harris is really hot. Is that who you want to be president? And everyone was like, yeah, I guess. And, things like that, and not necessarily defining her, which allowed her to, really figure out, how is she going to take this message across the country? How is she going to build out and staff a campaign? Actually leading up to and since the debate, it almost felt like Kamala started to cede the airwaves a bit. But as part of like a larger strategy to kind of put Trump in people's faces and expose him and have people remember, wait a second, when Trump was in office, I didn't like the chaos. I didn't like that he never stopped talking. I didn't like that, he conducted foreign policy by tweet and hired and fired cabinet members by tweet. And really it started with the debate because if you'll remember, during the planning process, the Harris campaign was really, really pushing for microphones to be on through the whole, 90 minutes so that Trump could continue to interrupt, and that she was hoping that he would interrupt and make himself seem more and more unpresidential as the debate went on. Obviously, the campaign didn't get their wish, which is why they had to pivot to a different strategy of just making him talk. And, all she had to do was say, people leave your rallies. And suddenly he's spewing off incredibly racist conspiracy theories about immigration. He's talking about all sorts of nonsense, and his defense for these things that he's making up is, I saw it on TV, the talking box told me. And they kind of did go away from that heading into the vice presidential debate, but it seems to be back, in swing to point out Trump is even more unhinged now than he was 4 years ago. He'll be even more unhinged in the White House. And I think that's going to be the Harris campaign's closing message. Now, how they press it is going to be what wins or loses this election. And it's also become, and the past 2 or 3 weeks have also been something of, for lack of a better term, a vibe shift, if you will, a feeling that the race was starting to shift towards Trump. Polling started to shift this way, his way. A general feeling of momentum started to shift his way. But then, once you take a step back and kind of contextualize, this is a close race. At least this looks to be a very close race, which means you should expect to see Trump ahead. You should expect to see some polling that doesn't necessarily look the way you might want it to if you don't want to see Trump back in the White House. And so the averages themselves really have not changed. And again, polling is not predictive. It's really just a snapshot of where we are in the current moment or where we were 2 weeks ago, which is why the only poll you should ever take as gospel is the Seltzer. But I really don't. I think we're in the beginning of kind of a vibe shift back in the direction of the Harris-Walz campaign, only because they're starting to put back really starting to restart their strategy of Trump as an unhinged madman, which is the message that worked so well for Democrats in 2020, as Trump being someone you couldn't trust to control the levers of power.
So and I do want to remind our viewers, thank you everyone for watching the live stream, that if you were to post a tasteful comment or question, I will be happy to share that with the panelists. I want to ask though, there's a lot of directions we could go here, but some of you have said some. Nathan, I think it's really interesting that you're saying you have more confidence that this won't be a nail biter. We just aren't going to know who the president is for weeks and weeks election, because you kind of anticipated something I've been thinking about, which is I take Kristen Soltis Anderson's point that polling cannot seem to show us who's going to win this thing with any reasonable amount of confidence. That's not necessarily the same as saying election night is going to be razor thin close. Close, I think. But I think, and Brooke, maybe this was to your point, sometimes there's a latent voter out there. 2016 was the Trump voter, right? That we couldn't figure out how to pull into polling, and then they show up and vote. Pollsters admit this. Kristen Soltis Anderson admitted this. There could be some latent group out there that we just don't know how to reach. So it may be that come election night, Trump or Harris will be the definitive winner, but we don't know that right now. And so I guess I'm kind of opening because I noticed, Eric, that seemed to get your attention when Nathan had suggested that. I was just curious what you thought about that.
A couple of thoughts on what Nathan and Mike have said. First, I hope Nathan is correct. I have been desirous for about the past 8 to 9 years, more so than wanting any political party to win or lose, wanting one of them to lose very, very badly. Because I think both of these political parties are behaving in inappropriate and bad ways currently. And I think the only thing that is going to change that trajectory for them is really getting the crap kicked out of them in a presidential election. The problem is that we have been having these very, very narrow elections for really since, with some limited exception. You have the Obama election in 2008. 2012 again becomes pretty close to the point where you would, pretty much no one on election night in 2008 thought that McCain was going to win. There were people on election night in 2012 that legitimately thought Mitt Romney was going to win. 2004 was a very close election. 2000 was a very close election. So I've been desirous for that kind of an outcome. I hope Nathan's right. I just don't think that he is. Like, I really want to be hopeful here that someone's going to get the crap beat out of them, but I just don't see that happening. The one other point that I wanted to make to Mike's what Mike had said earlier. One, I think the economy argument for the Democrats is just gone. I think it's just sailed. The experience of people, particularly through the lens of inflation over the last 4 years, looking back at the 4 years before it, I don't think any amount of telling them how great the S&P gains were under Barack Obama and how they lacked under Donald Trump is going to convince the American voter that the economy was actually better for them in the last 4 years than it was in the 4 years before. I think polling, again, to the extent that you can pull out the sentiments of people in that, are pretty clear that they're unhappy with the state of the economy now, and they were happier with it when Trump was president. I want to add the caveat that I hate the way that we constantly attribute the success or failure of the economy to the actions of the president of the United States.
Or in this case, the vice president of the United States.
Or in this case, the vice president of the United States. That is not how these things work. It's correlation. It's not causation, but I still think that point stands. The other is Mike and I might have different definitions of what it means to be a disciplined candidate. If you watch the Brett Baer interview that Harris did, she constantly was pivoting back to making the answer to every question, Donald Trump is on the ballot. That is message discipline in a sense. I think it's a bad message, and I don't think she had a particularly good performance. And I think she reminded people in that interview that she is at best a middling to mediocre political talent, because I think at least a decent political talent would have been able to parry the questions that she was getting from Baer a lot more effectively than she has been able to. I think the fact that she did not do a lot of interviews, that she didn't go into friendly environments that were going to give her harder questions than she was getting, ill prepared her for some of these experiences. Although I did not think she did terribly in the Baer interview, I think she left a lot to be desired, and as a candidate leaves a lot to be desired as a communicator. So maybe she's disciplined in a sense of the word, but that is not what I think of when I observe her as a candidate.
Can I just say something really quickly on just Harris, and then previously before Harris, Hillary Clinton as female candidates for president? And something that is often noted about female candidates is likability in a way that male candidates, even though we discuss their likability, there is something different there that voters are looking for, whether it's fair or not. There is a temptation by female candidates to emulate a male candidate, but it comes across oftentimes as disingenuous or just fake. And Harris does not rank high in likability, and I think a part of that is answers like what she gave during the Brett Baer interview, where it's just like it seems so rote and just almost condescending. And whether this is fair or not, it's just women, there is an expectation for them to communicate more graciously, even if they are running for the highest office in the land. And I think that Harris and then Clinton before her sort of stepped away from their femininity in a way that they shouldn't have, and it did them more of a disservice in terms of voter likability. So that's a whole opinion set that maybe is entirely subjective, but I say it as a woman, and I just think that that's something that it's hard to quantify it, but that's an element of this too, is just Harris, I think, is not extremely likable for a number of the unaffiliated or swing voters.
And
So
Brooke,
one more quick
I
point
wanted to
on-
ask you about that right quick, Brooke, because I'm to press into it a little. You mentioned Harrison and Hillary Clinton together, but are you saying that they suffer from very similar problems, identical? Because Hillary Clinton was always kind of depicted as the opposite of what of the very effeminate. She was tough as nails. She was not, she was conniving. She was calculating. Are you saying that Harris has some of those same qualities, or is it different somehow?
I think both of them have qualities that don't come across as authentic. They present differently, but it is a lack of, I would say, softness and authenticity that I think female candidates should lean into. I'm not a political consultant, but I deal in politics all the time. And I do think there's an element of that a lot of female candidates are advised to steer away from. And I think they shouldn't, because it actually makes them seem more likable and more competent. I think about someone like a Margaret Thatcher. She was every bit as feminine, but still fierce and forceful. And I don't see, it almost strikes me as Harris and Clinton before her almost seemed like they tried to prove something a little too hard rather than just leaning into who they were. And so I don't know how that's going to translate into suburban female voters in particular, but there's something there that I think rings hollow with some voters.
If I could chime in, well, first of all, I just appreciate the feedback. I want to jump in as it pertains to the Brett Baer interview in particular. I would counter argue. I think Harris actually exhibited a lot of discipline. First of all, these interviews, going back before her media blitz, the criticism from the right was that she was not putting herself out more for exposure with one-on-one interviews. When she had the interview with CNN with Dana Bash, the criticism was that she was not by herself. She was with her running mate. And then she did a media blitz. She was on The View. She was on late night television. She did radio shows. She did podcasts. She went to the Lions Den and Fox News. And I think that, the criticism, of course, didn't change. That was no surprise. But I think in the sense that even in the interview, you had Brett Baer acknowledging, look, there was a mistake during the interview. He made the admission that on that roughly 24 hours after his interview, that they showed the clip that, they showed the wrong clip, basically. Yeah. One of the most contentious parts of that interview was when Harris criticized her opponent, Trump, for saying that he might have to call out the National Guard or military to deal with, quote unquote, the enemy within, whom he defined as radical left lunatics. Baer then said, that, his colleague asked Trump about his enemy within comment, and this is how he responded. And the clip showed Trump saying that he wasn't threatening anybody. Harris called him out and said, don't play in my face. That's not the clip. That's not the clip. And the fact that he admitted afterwards that was a mistake, and the choice of the clip that they used, I think, speaks volumes to the fact that maybe another candidate potentially might have let that go, and then the narrative would have been Bear caught her, right? That he got her, and that would have been repeatedly played on the airwaves, for the at least 48 hours after that. So that's what I mean in terms of discipline. She's able to hold her ground. She's able to counterpunch. She's able to make an articulate, cohesive, strong argument against any criticism that's been thrown in her way. Even on more friendly territory with Charlemagne said, "Look, the Biden-Harris administration bears responsibility for the southern border," and Harris said, "Charlemagne." And she pivoted right back to the Republican sponsored bill. And she said, "Look, we've been ready. We've shown a willingness to give literally Republicans exactly what they've been wanting on this issue." And Trump played politics with the issue. So I think in that sense, in terms of staying on message, bringing it back to how America First is really in her campaign. And then the fact that she even got the endorsement of so many Republicans from the Bush administration, folks who worked for McCain, folks who worked for Romney, folks who worked all the way back to Reagan. And she was flanked from her left and right, from folks ranging from Liz Cheney to national security advisors to Adam Kinzinger. That to me is a very consistent message that this is the pro-democracy candidate. Her message, I think she picked up exactly where Biden left off on July 21st, is that this election is not about, as important as all these issues are, they all come second to the fact that, are we going to have a system or not? Another point I want to bring up is October 28th is usually an interesting day for elections. And ironically, it's my birthday. October 28th, 1980, Reagan looked at the American people in the eye and said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And that line, for years later, people have characterized that particular line as really symbolic and indicative of the fact that people looked at Reagan. They said, "This is not a right-wing lunatic. This is someone we could trust with the nuclear codes. In fact, this is someone we could trust with the economy." And they said, "We're not better off than we were 4 years ago." This is how a lot of folks characterize that period of American history. I think, in going back to what I was saying about Democrats making a better message about the economy, that the Democrats have the opportunity to say, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" 4 years ago, there was no federal plan to address COVID. 4 years ago, Trump took us out the World Health Organization during the height of the pandemic. 4 years ago, you were lied to about when this pandemic was going to get under control, about the rate of folks who are going to be killed. Bob Woodward just released in his book that Trump was giving out COVID tests to Russia during that time period. Our adversaries, who it literally blatantly infiltrated our 2016 election and wants to outdo us in any way possible. And so I think, going back to the economy message, we could say, look, yeah, inflation. Let's be honest, inflation is still an issue, but let's look at ourselves compared to the rest of the world. We are in a better position. Name one country that wouldn't want to switch places with the United States.
Mike, I love you, man, but that is just not the way that voters are analyzing the economic question. They are not thinking back to Trump didn't have a plan for COVID. When people are asked the question right now, do you think you're better off than you were 4 years ago? The first thing that is going to go through people's minds is, my grocery bill is 20 to 30% higher than it was 4 years ago. That is the way that question is going to be answered. Inflation, I'm sorry, is going to be a burden that is going to be Biden who is going to have to carry, and it is Harris who is going to have to carry that into the election. I appreciate the good faith effort put forward there to make an argument that people are going to answer the question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, in a way other than I think they're obviously going to answer it. If you look at the right track, wrong track numbers, people don't think that we're on the right track. People really don't think we're better off than they were 4 years ago. Now, the bizarre nature of this election, in that it is pitting the guy who was president from 8 to 4 years ago against the vice president from the last 4 years, complicates matters. It's not a clear turning of the page thing. And I think it's bared out in the polling. It's bared out in how close this race is, and the fact that it's a toss-up, and the fact that either of them could win. But man, I just do not buy that line of argument on if people are asked if they're better off, they're going to go, yeah, Trump was really bad on COVID. I'm sorry. The first thing that they're going to think of is how much money they have to pay more than they did 4 years ago for the basic necessities that they need to live. And it's Democrats who are going to bear the brunt of that, whether or not it's like really their fault. And I think it's way more complicated than people want to give it credit for, but they're going to be the one to politically bear the brunt of it.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
not
first
arguing.
off, I have to
Yeah, I was going to say.
I have to point out,
real quick, just 2 seconds.
yeah,
I'm not arguing against the notion that Republicans are winning on the economy. Of course, they're winning. My argument goes back to the fact that Democrats are not making that message. They're not making the connection. Look, remember when you couldn't find toilet paper at Walmart because there was just chaos, because people were scared, because they were thinking, I've got to stock up on all these basic necessities. They have to make that connection because, truth be told,
I'm saying that that's not the connection that they need to make. Like, I just think you're way off base on this one.
Yeah, let's Nathan. Let's hear from Nathan here. He's been patiently waiting.
I do have to say, first off, right track, wrong track, with that, just that question on its own without further context of why is not necessarily a very functional question in American politics anymore. In 2022, for example, there was a very large percentage of Americans who thought the country was on the wrong track, but instead of flipping against the Democrats and producing the sequel to the 2010 red wave, what we saw was Democrats picking up a seat in the Senate. We saw them only very narrowly losing the House, and only because of a shocking underperformance in New York and California at the congressional level. But right track, wrong track can also be because in 22, Democrats' closing argument wasn't about prices, it was about right-wing extremism and tying it to Trump. And then you had the January 6th committee also to really burnish that case. So Americans said we're on the wrong track, yes, but on the wrong track because, and connected the why we're on the wrong track to Trump, to January 6th, to extremism as a whole, to a Supreme Court that was becoming increasingly viewed not just as a inherently political body as one of the branches of government, but as an increasingly partisan body that was doing that, whose opinions tended to mirror the 2020 Republican platform. Now on the economy, you're right, it's a lot more complex. Inflation is a much more complex picture than just Democrats came into office and then we had inflation. Holistically, COVID did play a very big role. And so connecting the "are you better off 4 years ago" question doesn't necessarily have to be on the economy. You can also say 4 years ago, we didn't know that the president was going to survive the very severe case of COVID he had that got him sent to Walter Reed Hospital in the first place. So yes, we can connect COVID, but it also speaks to the challenge that Kamala Harris faces and that every other incumbent so far across the G7 has had to face, which is that the economic recovery from COVID has not been as fast as most people would like to expect. A post-COVID world is starting to look increasingly like the pre-COVID world, when there were a lot of signs that maybe we could try to build a better, more modern society instead of the old order that we were so used to. And really, you look across the world and you see the same thing. UK, the last election, the Conservatives were up. They won a historic landslide. The very next election, their former several actually of their party front bench lost their seats. Their party leader had to resign party leadership because they got wiped out so badly. You look at France, how European elections decimated the center-right, the center, and the center-left. And how they had to have snap elections. You look at Germany, where the post-Merkel coalition is only going to exist for one cycle because the Conservative Party of the German Social Union is preparing to sweep right back into power. You look at Canada, where Trudeau is facing the same problem. You look at Japan, which is on its third prime minister, and especially not just third prime minister, but third party leader, because the Liberal Democratic Party performed so poorly in their own set of elections. And so that's the greater challenge, not just for so when we look at this race, it's not necessarily Kamala is fumbling a winnable race. It's she's fighting with everything she's got in a race that really should be priced in for the anti-incumbent side and anti-incumbent party. Interestingly enough, though, on the economy, she does trail Trump, but it's not by a very wide margin. But the money number that she's doing really well on is not the economy, but cares about people like me, because that's how Obama won in 2012. He pulled into a tie with Mitt Romney on the economy. And if you remember Mitt Romney, before he was a politician, before he was a senator from Utah or the governor of Massachusetts, he was a venture capitalist. And so, because he handled a multi-million-dollar venture capital company whose partners own shares in the Boston Celtics and things of that nature, he naturally got good marks on the economy until Obama tied Bain Capital to the financial crisis and said Mitt Romney is only in it for rich guys like himself. He's not in it for people like you. And Obama won on the question of who cares more about people like me while tying on the economy. We're seeing something very similar in this cycle. Kamala still has a bit of distance to close, but it's interesting because in swing districts like mine, we're seeing a whole lot of advertising about how Trump is going to cut taxes on the wealthy, but Kamala wants to give working people tax cuts. So I do think that's going to start. That's something to track and some numbers to look at as we sit around our TV screens on November 5th and wait to see what happens.
And just to that point, and Nate and I have talked repeatedly, I've always said, why do Democrats wait until until October to release the Kraken? Why are they releasing Obama now? It was Obama in one of the first campaign stumps that said, there are folks who are out there that have a fuzzy memory about the economy. Yeah, it was a good economy because it was my economy. And I said to myself, where was this Obama for the past 8 years? He left office in 2017 and Trump, repeatedly said the economy is great. The economy is great. 75 months of consecutive job growth when he left in 2017. And I'm just wondering why it took so long for them to toot their own horn. Perhaps had they done so earlier, the numbers that Eric was referring to about, them doing well in the economy, perhaps that would have been a little tighter right now.
This is all interesting questions we can get into. I'm going to try to steer us a little bit back toward the election at hand. I enjoy the conversation. It's just as is often the case in these panels, we can pick a rabbit trail and never leave it. I am curious, based, Eric, on something you had said. I think we share the sort of you use different words than I do. This notion that you're hopeful one of the parties. You might have a preference, but you're hopeful at least one of the parties taking the election because that could do some sort of a reset and be healthy to our politics. I say the same thing in 2024 that I did in 2020, which is that my number one hope is not who wins this presidential election. And I do have a preference, but it's not who wins it. It's that somebody wins it and that everybody agrees that's the person that wins it and that we all get to say, okay, this strategy worked and this one over here clearly did not. I think one of the dangers in a close race is that, Eric, again, as you had said, that anything and nothing gets to count for why it went this direction. And it seems like both parties, at least in recent years, have been really, really bad about learning all the wrong lessons or over-interpreting all of the results in any race and then doubling down on those things. Specific questions or I'm sorry, specific examples aren't coming to mind at the moment, but I guess we'll open that up sort of to a discussion. Is that, I guess the broader question is, what does it take for us to get out of this seemingly very stuck moment? Like if this is the rest of our lives, this sort of just razor thin back and forth, we don't really know who's going to win. You don't have an FDR, you don't have a Ronald Reagan figure to kind of pull the nation one direction or the other. What does that take? Is just the new normal or what brings us to an end?
I'd like to see the stakes just lowered in general. I mean, who cares who the president is if he doesn't always hold so much power all the time and the states actually function as they're supposed to be functioning and we have the test labs for liberty there. And so I think part of it is just we have so upped the ante at the federal level and there has been just so many conspiracy theories and election integrity questions that it just, it gets the public ginned up. And there are very few things that can motivate as much as fear and feeling as if you've been cheated out of something. And so I think one at least element of this that I hope changes over time is that people and voters begin looking more towards their local and state elections as far more consequential, and are more invested in that, so that the presidential elections and what's happening in Congress aren't nearly as top of mind for them. Because honestly, when has Congress really done something big lately? I mean, it's just they don't move forward very quickly, and that's how they were designed. And then really, what does the president's role have in your everyday life in ways that like the state government and your governors and state and senators have? And so I think that's really important. And so it's going to take a shift in civic education, I think.
Let me endorse everything that Brooke just said. I would also like if what is happening on the federal level was of far less importance to those of us in our daily lives, except for us chosen self-hating few who do these kinds of things and want to talk about it endlessly. I don't know what gets us out of it. I mean, I would just for funsies, I think it would be really great to see some presidential candidate who does not run the way that just about every presidential candidate has run since, I would say, 2004, which is to take as for granted that this is a narrowly divided country, and that the best possible way is to turn the gain up all the way on your party's base to try to get as many of your most dedicated people out. I mean, this really was the Obama re-elect campaign's success in 2012, was identifying and getting out voters that were low propensity voters. It's one of the things that has really upturned the apple cart with Donald Trump, is that he has been able, him only, I think we should know, then this is a really important point, I think, him only as an individual has been able to turn out these low propensity voters on the Republican side. No other candidate has been really able to do that consistently, running as a Republican, even when they have tried to ape Donald Trump in all of the things that he does and says and the ways that he acts. He remains unique, sui generis in that sense. I would really just like to see a presidential candidate run not trying to use that strategy and actually trying to appeal to a broader coalition than the one that is gifted to them, the 49% or so of people that is gifted to them, and then just trying to eke it across the finish line. I'd like to see someone actually try to run and win by 7, 8, 9 points, run and win convincingly in the Electoral College. I just don't see that being what either Trump or Harris is doing here. I don't think it's what Trump and Biden did. I don't think it's what Trump and Clinton did. I don't think it is what Obama and Romney did. And I think we can go back and back through presidential cycles. It has been a long time since anyone has even tried to win a significant governing majority. And I frankly just like to see someone give it a try.
So, Eric, I want to ask you about that, because granted, a lot of time has passed since then, but at the DNC, that's exactly what I heard most of the talking heads on the right saying, was like, this is weird. She's actually trying to appeal to a broader base than just the far left within the party. Like, we haven't seen something like this in a while. Are you saying that she's just not gone far enough in your view?
I think there's I think there's a and I'm hoping Brooke will also echo my point on this as someone also engaged in communication strategy. The messenger matters a whole lot, and she is an utterly unconvincing messenger. As somebody who has been a senator and attorney general from the state of California, and somebody who ran the way that she did in the Democratic primary in 2019, to be a person who is, I think, capable of casting that broad net, of trying to build that broader coalition. They were saying the right things at the DNC. I just don't think that she is the kind of candidate that people are going to buy that from. So I think you're going to need, I'm really looking forward on the other side of this election to hopefully start talking on what does the bench look like on the Republican and the Democratic sides, and who is going to come after this group of people, because I hope they are better and more politically talented than the ones we currently have, because the current crop we have, at least to me, leaves a lot to be desired.
I'll jump in and I'll say, I think we're a world away from any kind of a landslide of election like Reagan versus Mondale, where Mondale wins Minnesota and Reagan wins 49 states.
Mondale also won DC. Don't dismiss DC.
You go on DC. You're right. I just want to acknowledge. I think that, you know, the 21st century, I think historians, when we're all old, will go back and really see that this was an incredibly polarized period of American history where, as Eric was pointing to, with the exception of 2008, we've always had close elections, very close elections. And I don't see any indication that that's going to change anytime soon, regardless of the candidate. I do believe that I find hope in legislation like the legislation that Biden signed into law on December 29th of 2022, the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act. This law, of course, seeks to reform the Electoral Count Act of 1887. It clarifies that the vice president's role in overseeing the certification of electoral votes is strictly ceremonial, no authority to alter or reject electoral results. It increases the threshold required for members of Congress to raise objections to a state certified election results. Certain legislation like this gives me hope that, that despite the potential threat of another January 6th like event unfolding, that we will still have somewhat of a transition of power, although may not be peaceful. But that aside, we do need to reassess, how to tackle, the constant placing of doubt on our electoral system. I think that, when we look at folks like Rusty Bowers of Arizona, who's the former Speaker of the House of that state, when we look at Brad Raffensperger, these are Republicans who wanted Donald Trump in office. When you look at Christopher Krebs, when you look, there's so many secretaries of state that could have, been to political pressure and didn't. And just by happenstance, we had those kinds of people with that kind of character and dedication to the Constitution in office. I do believe that we need to reward politically folks like that, Republican or Democrat. I think in that case, Republican. Those Republicans need to be reelected. Those Republicans need to be bolstered. We need to have Republicans like that seeking office. And my fear is that folks of moral character, folks with integrity, folks who are strictly adhering to the Constitution, will become far less and less as we get further along in the 21st century. But I'm hopeful. Hope springs eternal. I do believe that folks like Christie, who ran, folks like the governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson. You had Nikki Haley, who disavowed and distanced themselves from Trump's, to this day, his refusal to accept the results of 2020. And those are the kinds of people that should be the next in line to be the nominee. My fear, though, is that the taste for this kind of hard right Trumpian like candidate, that void will be filled with someone in the mold of Trump, maybe like a J.D. Vance, who refuses to this day to accept the 2020 results in alignment with his boss. Someone like Ted Cruz, who was on the debate stage with his opponent, Colin Allred, who's doing pretty good in terms of polling, and also refused to acknowledge the results of the election, and who himself was the first person before the chaos unfolded to challenge the results. I think that it's going to take a bipartisan effort to make an intentional decision, just like the Cheneys did, just like John McCain's son did, and so many other Republicans, to say, look, if it means that I'm not going to get my marginal tax rates in this term, so be it. I'm going to continue to support and reward the candidate that stands for democratic principles at the very least. And it's going to keep, in the words of Michael Steele, the former RNC chair, Republicans are going to keep having to get beat until they get it in their head that you have to promote pro-democracy candidates, not a candidate that's going to say, I look to Viktor Orban, who endorsed me for president, to say that I'm going to be doing well on the world stage.
I think that in all of these things, Brooke, I think your point about like a more civically educated electorate really does stand out. I think an electorate that is highly engaged, and not in like the hyper partisan sense, but in the sense of wanting to know what's going on and having an opinion about the issues. An electorate that looks like that is not an electorate that nominates Donald Trump to be president 3 times in a row. It's not. And similarly, I think we haven't seen national campaigns that are disciplined and focused in a very long time. But mostly, I think what we need is, and you're not going to like some of this because it sounds very, democratic, but I'm the token lefty on tonight. So
Yeah, you're
I
to the
have to
left of
give you,
Mike, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, I have to give you your money's worth, Josh.
I'm more conservative than he is.
We need, for one, leaders who are willing to act, because when we have this constant raising of the stakes, it raises an expectation of your voter of, we are going to take significant corrective actions to address the focus he wants, to address the issues that you want us to focus on. Excuse me. For Trump, it was immigration. It was building the wall. For Obama, it was healthcare. For Biden, it was ending the pandemic, and bringing down the temperature. And when that happens, when you over deliver in that way, and by default you have to under deliver, and that makes people not take their politicians seriously. It makes them not take their system seriously, and it makes them most dangerously start to wonder if the institutions themselves are worth saving. That's really how you get these massive populist waves one way or the other, because you have too many people who think, look, our system is, in my personal view, our system is not perfect, don't get me wrong, but I think the framers were onto some pretty good things, and we have to try to see them out. But there are too many people who see special interests having more of a voice in the way things are done than ordinary voters, and see a culture of harsh partisanship where people are screaming all sorts of insults at each other over the airwaves, and then going into secret rooms and dark rooms and shaking hands and smoking cigars and being best friends and being on each other's Christmas card lists. And they start to
I
think,
wish that still happened.
right. And they start to think, is this, are we being duped, or are we really in danger? And when you have moments like this where we're all really in danger, you have a lot of people who are just going to shrug their shoulders and say, I lived through everything before, I guess I'll live through this too. So you need an engaged electorate, you need an educated electorate, you need to cut special interests away. You need to push them away from the big boys table and say they need to wait in line like everyone else. You need all of those things, and you also need a little more, I don't want to say populism, but a little more democracy, because when you have a country that swings one way, and I'm not saying America is a left-wing country, because I think most people would agree that it would probably be center right. But when you have an electorate where 60% of the country thinks that that banning abortions before most people know they're pregnant is inhumane, and a Supreme Court that says, leave that to the states, when you that causes a lot of frustration for people. When you have a country where in either election, one party might win full control of government but might not be able to pass any of its platform because one person in the minority can stand up and say, I don't want this to happen, people start to wonder, what's the point of living in a democracy if the things I'm voting for are not getting enacted? So we mostly just need our politicians to deliver on what they promise, and not in a big grand sense, but to say, I'm going to fix your roads and bridges, and fix the roads and bridges. Have connected politicians that we know we can trust and rely on, and build from there. Start small and mushroom.
Nathan, there is a lot packaged in there. I would love for us to spend another hour. We're very much out of time, but that is sort of
going to say, and then we can.
Brooke, why don't you as a standout lady joining the group, why don't you give us your closing thoughts there, and then I'll close us out for the evening.
Well, I just wanted to note, I think that the example of abortion and the Supreme Court's ruling on that, Nathan, you said we need more democracy. I think giving it back to the states is more democracy, because that really does empower people at a more concentrated level to be able to decide what it looks like for them and what abortion law is. So I would say hooray for more federalism. I want to see more of that. I want to see more things brought back to the states, rather than a president issuing executive orders and appointing the EPA and Homeland Security to do all of these things that really would be best at the state level. And I'll
I,
leave it
s-
at that.
I suspect we're not going to solve the abortion debate in the next 30 seconds. So I will simply say, Nathan, to that point, that is kind of what I was saying. That is the evergreen argument often between the left and the right, is exactly where is federalism appropriate? Exactly what do we mean by democratization? What decisions are centralized, these are wonderful topics to debate. We're going to have to save that for some other conversation. I appreciate each and every one of you tonight. This has been as usual, these cross-partisan conversations are usually one of our better ones. I think we all have to kind of stay on our toes because we know there are people on the call that are going to check us if we say something kind of lazy. So Mike, Nathan, Eric, Brooke, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you everyone out there for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the Saving Elephants YouTube channel, but also the podcast. There is a robust podcast there too. Subscribe, rate, review, all the things. It's great to see you guys, and we will see you all next time.